Yesterday, we read through the foreword of the Mystical Qabalah by Dion Fortune. You got to know a little bit about me, and there's nothing else to say other than welcome to the Arcanum Luminarium. So we are on to Chapter 1 of the Mystical Qabalah, a guide to the Sephiroth by Dion Fortune. And the first chapter is entitled The Yoga of the West. So let's just get right into it. Very few students of occultism know anything at all about the fountainhead whence the tradition springs. Many of them do not know there is a Western tradition. Scholarship is baffled by the intentional blinds and defenses with which initiates both ancient and modern have wrapped themselves about, and concludes that the few fragments of a literature which have come down to us are medieval forgeries. They would be greatly surprised if they knew that these fragments, supplemented by manuscripts that have never been allowed to pass out of the hands of initiates, and completed by an oral tradition, are handed down in schools of initiation to this day, and are used as the basis of practical works of the Yoga of the West. The adepts of those races whose evolutionary destiny is to conquer the physical plane and evolved a yoga technique of their own, which is adapted to their special problems and peculiar needs. This technique is based upon a well-known but little understood Kabbalah, the wisdom of Israel. It may be asked why it is that a Western nation should go to the Hebrew culture for their mystical traditions. The answer to this question, which will be readily understood by those who are acquainted with the esoteric theory concerning races and sub-races. Everything must have a source. Cultures do not spring out of nothing. The seed-bearers of each new phase of culture must of necessity arise within the preceding culture. No one can deny that Judaism was the matrix of a European spiritual culture when they recall the fact that Jesus and Paul were both Jews. No race except the Jewish race could possibly have served as the stock upon which new dispensations was to be grafted, because no other races was monotheistic. Pantheism and polytheism had their day, and a new and more spiritual culture was due. The Christian races owe their religion to the Jewish culture, as surely the Buddhist races of the East owe theirs to the Hindu culture. The mysticism of Israel supplies the foundation of modern Western occultism. It forms the theoretical basis upon which all ceremonial is developed. Its famous glyph, the Tree of Life, is the best meditation symbol we possess because it is the most comprehensive. It is not my intention to write a historical study of the sources of the Kabbalah, but rather to show the uses that are made of it by modern students of the mysteries. For although the roots of our system are in a tradition, there's no reason why we should be hidebound by tradition. A technique that is being actually practiced is a growing thing, for the experience of each worker enriching it and becomes part of the common heritage. It is not necessarily incumbent upon us to do certain things or hold certain ideas because the rabbis who lived before Christ had certain views. The world has moved on since those days, and we are under a new dispensation. But what was true in principle then will be true in principle now, and of value to us. The modern Kabbalist is their heir of the ancient Kabbalists, but he must reinterpret doctrine and reformulate method in the light of the present dispensation, if the heritage he has received is to be of any practical value to him. I do not claim that the modern Kabbalist teachings, as I have learned them, are identical with those of the pre-Christian rabbis, but I claim that they are legitimate descendants thereof in the natural development therefrom. The nearer the source, the purer the stream. In order to discover first principles, we must go to the fountainhead. But a river receives many tributaries in the course of its flow, and these needs are not necessarily be polluted. If we want to discover whether they are pure or not, we compare them with the pristine stream, and if they pass the test, they may well be permitted to mingle with the main body of waters and swell their strength. So it is with a tradition that which is non-antagonistic will be assimilated. We must always test the purity of a tradition by referencing to first principles but we shall equally judge the vitality of a tradition by the power at which it is assimilated. It is only a dead faith which remains influenced by contemporary thought. The original stream of hebraic mysticism has received many tributaries. We see it rise among the nomad star worshippers of the Chaldea, where Abraham in his tent among his flocks hears the voice of God, but Abraham has a shadowy background which vast forms move half seen. The mysterious figures of a great priest-king, born without father, without mother, without descendant, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, and ministers to him the first Eucharist feast of the bread and wine after the battle with the kings in the valley, a sinister king of Edom, who ruled ere there was a king in Israel, whose kingdoms are unbalanced force. Generation by generation we trace the intercourses of the princes of Israel with the priest kings of Egypt. Abraham and Jacob went thither. Joseph and Moses were intimately associated with the court of the royal adepts. When we read of Solomon sending to Hiram, king of Tyre, for the materials to aid in the building of the temple, we know that the famous Tyrian mysteries must have profoundly influenced the Hebrew esotericism. When we read of Daniel being educated in the palaces of Babylon, we know that the wisdom of the Magi must have been accessible to the Hebrew Illuminati. This ancient mystical tradition of the Hebrews possessed three literatures, the Book of the Law and the Prophets, which are known to us as the Old Testament, the Talmud, or the collection of learning commentaries thereon, and the Qabalah, or mystical interpretations thereof. Of these three, the ancient rabbis say that the first is the body of the tradition, the second is the rational soul, and the third is the immortal spirit. Ignorant men may with profit read the first. Learned men study the second, but the wise meditate upon the third. It is a strange thing that the Christian exegesis has never sought the keys of the Old Testament and the Kabbalah. In our Lord's day, there were three schools of religious thought in Palestine, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, of which we read so frequently in the Gospels, and the Essenes, who are never referred to. Esoteric traditions avers that the boy Jesus ben Joseph, when his calibre was recognized by the learned doctors of the law who heard him speak in the temple at the age of 12, was sent by them to the Essenian community near the Dead Sea to be trained into the mystical traditions of Israel, and that he remained there until he came to John to be baptized in the Jordan before commencing his mission at the age of 30. Be that as it may, the closing clause of the Lord's Prayer is pure Kabbalism, Malkuth, the kingdom, Ad, the power, Netzach, the glory, forming the basal triangle of the tree of life. With Yesod, the foundation or receptacle of influences, as the central point. Whoever formulated that prayer knew his Kabbalah. Christianity has its esotericism in the Gnosis, which vows much to both Greek and Egyptian thought. In the system of Pythagoras, we see an adaptation of the Kabbalistic principles to Greek mysticism. The exoteric, state-organized section of the Christian church persecuted and stamped out the esoteric sections, destroying every trace of its literature upon which it laid hands and striving to eradicate the very memory of a gnosis from human history. It is recorded that the baths and bakehouses of Alexandria were fired for 6 months with the manuscripts from the great library. Very little remains to us of our spiritual heritage in the ancient wisdom. Everything that was above ground was swept away, and it is only with the excavation of ancient monuments and sands have swallowed that we are beginning to rediscover its fragments. It was not until the 15th century, when the power of the church was beginning to show signs of weakening, the men dared to commit to paper the traditional wisdom of Israel. Scholars declare that Kabbalah is the medieval forgery because they cannot trace a succession of early manuscripts. But those who know the manner of working of esoteric fraternities know the whole cosmogony and psychology can be conveyed in a glyph, which means nothing to the uninitiated. These strange old charts could be handed on from generation to generation, their explanations being communicated verbally, and the true interpretation would never be lost. When in doubt as to the explanation of some abstruse point, reference would be made to the sacred glyph, and meditation thereon would unfold. What generations of meditation have ensouled therein. It is well known to the mystics that if a man meditates upon a symbol symbol around which certain ideas have been associated by past meditation, he will obtain access to those ideas, even if the glyph has never been elucidated to him by those who have received the oral tradition by mouth to ear. The organized temporal force of the church availed to drive all rivals from the field and destroy their traces. We little know what seeds of the mystical tradition sprang up only to be cut down during the Dark Ages, but mysticism is inherent in the human race, and although the church has destroyed all roots of tradition in her group soul, nevertheless devout spirits within her fold rediscover the techniques of the soul's approach to God, and developed a characteristic yoga of their own, closely akin to the Bhakti yoga of the East. The literature of Catholicism is rich in treatises on which mystical theology, which reveals practical acquaintances with the higher states of consciousness, though a somewhat naive concept of the psychology thereof, thus revealing the poverty of a system which does not avail itself to the experience of tradition. The Bhakti Yoga of the Catholic Church is only suitable for those whose temperament is naturally devotional, and who find their readiest expression in loving self-sacrifice. But it is not everybody who is of this type, and Christianity is unfortunate in not having any choice of systems to offer its aspirants. The East, being tolerant, is wise, and has developed various yoga methods, each of which is pursued by its adherents to the exclusion of the others, and yet none would deny that the other methods are also paths to God for those to whom they are suited. In consequence of the deploration limitation on the part of our theology, many Western aspirants take upon Eastern methods. For those who are able to live in the Eastern conditions and work under the immediate supervision of a guru, this may prove satisfactory, but it is seldom given good results, when the various systems are pursued with no other guide than a book, and under unmodified Western conditions. It is for this reason that I would recommend to the white races the traditional Western system, which is admirable adaptation to their psychic constitution. It gives immediate results, and if done under proper supervision, not only does it not disturb the mental or physical equipoise, as happens with the regrettable frequency when unsuitable systems are used, but it produces a unique vitality. It is this peculiar vitality of the adepts which led to the tradition of the elixir of life. I have known a number of people in my time who might justly be considered adepts, and I have always been struck by the peculiar ageless vitality they are possessed. On the other hand, however, I can only endorse what all the gurus of the Eastern tradition have always averred, that any system of psycho-spiritual development can only be safely and adequately carried on under the person's supervision of an experienced teacher. For this reason, although I shall give in these pages the principles of the Mystical Qabalah, I do not consider it would be in anybody's interest to give the keys to its practice, even if by the terms of the obligation of my own initiation I were not forbidden to do so. But on the other hand, I do not consider it fair to the reader to introduce intentional blindfolds and misinformation, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, the information I give is accurate, even if incomplete. The 32 mystical paths of the concealed glory are ways of life, and those who want to unravel their secrets must tread them. As I myself was trained, so can anyone be trained who is willing to undergo the discipline, and I will gladly indicate the way to any earnest seeker. And that's the end of chapter 1. Now is probably the time to also mention that I don't always agree with everything that an author says. Things are written in different times. Kabbalah and magic and the esoterics are meant for everybody. I don't care who you are. As long as you have an interest and a drive to learn magic and occultism, that's all you need. You don't need a mentor. You should have guides of somewhat. You need to kind of have a general gist. It's helpful to have someone who's been down the path a little ways. I've had a few in my life. Lon is probably my main at this point, along with other people's works. But Lon gave me the strongest basis that I could ever get. So if you haven't already, I recommend going out, watch some of his readings, or go pick up his book and read it yourself, your choice. On Milo Duquette's work is a great way to get to understand this stuff. But this was the first book I read way back in the beginning when I was learning this stuff, and it kind of does a decent job of kind of giving you the feel for what the Tree of Life is, Kabbalah, and all that stuff. Gives you a little bit of an idea without going too deep that you get lost. So that's it. That's the end of today's reading. I hope you enjoyed. We'll be back again tomorrow. And until then, have a wonderful day.